Welcome to Green Time TV. Have you ever seen the beautiful octagonal building for University City's City Hall on Delmar Street? That's one of the buildings we're going to be talking about in tonight's program on preserving historic University City. I'm host Don Fitz, and with me I have Esley Hamilton, who is well known for writing about the history of the architecture and buildings of University City. Esley, we're so glad that you could make it to the show tonight.
Thank you for asking me.
Okay, now tell me, what have you been researching? How long have you been researching issues of history of University City?
Well, I moved to University City in 1972, and I got on my first commission, I think, in 1979.
Okay, so quite a while.
Yeah.
And now, tell me this. People, it's not just University City, it's not just the city of St. Louis or even the U.S., it's people all over the world who are concerned about historic buildings and historic monuments. I can't remember what year it was that the Taliban blew up some old Buddhist temples or figurines, and I think it was Afghanistan, and people were very upset. Why would people care so much, whatever country they're in, about these very, very old buildings?
Well, for one thing, it's their age is very impressive, the fact that they survived the battering of the centuries, but also because they were such great achievements to start with. And I think that's where University City comes in, because it was a great achievement in architecture and city planning. But around the world, people admire the traditional materials, traditional building forms, walkable communities, and in many nations, they're doing much more in terms of legal protection to make sure that those things are around for future generations.
I really enjoyed what you said about walkable communities, because now when you see new buildings go up, they must always have the window sealed, as if you never want to open the window during fall and spring, and that every building has temperature control, and you never see awnings on new buildings. You know, it's always like a self-contained, and so those old buildings really remind us that people used to know how to keep cool or less hot in the summer and less cold in the winter by the way that they designed buildings.
Right, and their trees. And that's another reason why University City has been so remarkable with their strong arborist program over the decades. They are mainly in the shade.
And that's very helpful. I know there have been controversies when University City has cut down very old trees, like a very old one in the golf course, a 100-year-old tree. And so, people get very upset about their trees being cut down. Now, what about University City? We're going to talk a lot about Civic Plaza, but are there other, that's the area around City Hall, but are there other historic buildings in University City that are notable?
Yes, I think overall University City is one of the best, most intact surviving examples of a turn-of-the-century community. It was incorporated in 1906 and really took off from that point onward. And so the Loop area is one of the last remaining really vital examples of a streetcar retail area with modestly sized buildings, 2 and 3 stories in height, and lots of storefronts. And of course, we're going to have the streetcar back later this year. And then the residential areas also reflect that. And many of the neighborhoods were designed with pedestrian walkways to make it easier to get to the streetcar, which went down Delmar and Pershing and some of the other main streets. Yeah,
I call them those walkways cut-throughs, but a lot of times you can walk through in the middle of a block in University City, and very often that helps you get to where the streetcar would have been decades and decades ago. And so basically, if those buildings along Delmar were torn down and they were instead, we had 12, 14, 16-story buildings put up, that would lose a lot of that history and a lot of where University City came from.
That's true, and it's even more true of houses. Many communities in St. Louis are experiencing teardowns, like Creve Coeur, for example, where there's hardly a mid-century neighborhood left that has all its original houses. But in University City, most of the houses have survived, and they are all in comparable scale, and also typically very fine materials in traditional styles, Georgian, Tudor Revival, and so on.
And so keeping as many of our old housing stock as we can really tells us where we came from. Now tell me this. I mentioned that Civic Plaza, are those buildings around City Hall. Could you tell me what Civic Plaza means, the phrase, and tell us about some of those Civic Plaza buildings?
Okay, sure. The founder of University City was E.G. Lewis, Edward Gardner Lewis, who originally was a newspaper and magazine publisher, and he built our present City Hall as his publishing headquarters with the World's Fair in mind. He built the building in 1903 at 5 very tall stories, which was certainly not necessary because that was out in the country. But it made the building visible from the World's Fairgrounds in Forest Park and Washington University.
You could see University City, City Hall from Forest Park without standing on a ladder.
Right, and attracted attention. So after the World's Fair, everybody was inspired by the fine architecture and civic planning of the fairgrounds. And Lewis then decided to use his magazine building as the centerpiece of a larger civic center that would include additional public buildings and also churches and schools. And he made a model which is still in existence in the lobby of the City Hall, showing what that would look like. And there were many much larger cities around the country that were doing the same thing at that time. And the biggest, of course, was Washington, D.C., where the central monumental area was totally rebuilt during that era. But most of the cities, like University City, had big plans, but they didn't quite finish them. And San Francisco and Cleveland are 2 notable examples of Beaux-Arts or City Beautiful civic centers. The great thing about University City was that the later architects who added buildings recognized that vision and followed that style, so that the domed building on the south side of Del Mar and the present Scientology building, which were both built in the 1920s, followed the same materials and traditional classical styles as the original buildings, and even as late as 1937 and 38, when the WPA, or actually the New Deal PWA, was building the new post office there, they still followed those classical styles and used the light brick.
So the U City Post Office is actually part of that design.
Right, and also the what's now the 560 Trinity Music Center of Washington University, which was built for, I'm forgetting the name of the Shar Emeth synagogue in 1931. Almost identical materials and detailing. And that's what makes the complex so remarkable, that over a period of 30 or 40 years, that same vision was held by all the people who built. And
let's take a break.
Okay.
And we're going to see a brief movie by Eleanor Mullen, talking about you'll see some visuals of some of these buildings, especially City Hall going up, and we'll be back in just a minute.
I'm Eleanor Mullen, president of the Historical Society of University City, and I've been a University City resident since the age of 2. Let me tell you about the historical sites covered by Proposition H. Proposition H, let's call it Proposition History. Your friends and neighbors got this initiative on the April ballot to protect some of our most cherished historic sites. The proposition states that if the city wishes to sell or demolish any of these sites, they first have to get approval by a vote of the people. E.G. Lewis erected these Gates of Opportunity in 1909 to mark the entrance to the residential portion of University City. Eames and Young were the architects. The lions were sculpted by George Julian Zolnay. They were recast in 1991 by Washington University. The magazine building was built in 1903 as the headquarters of E.G. Lewis's publishing business. Designed by architect Herbert Chivers, the octagonal 5-story building is 135 feet high, and the spotlight on top made the building an attraction in itself during the 1904 World's Fair. It was purchased by the city in 1930. On April 5th, you will have the opportunity to ensure that our whole community makes the decision on whether or not to save these historic sites. The Lions Gates are our Statue of Liberty. The City Hall is our Empire State Building. Will the citizens of New York allow these iconic structures to be destroyed? Vote yes on Proposition H. Talk to your neighbors. Your vote matters.
Welcome back to Green Time. I'm host Don Fitz, and with me I'm pleased to have Esley Hamilton, who is very knowledgeable of the historic buildings of University City. Esley, before the break, you were telling us about all these different buildings around Civic Plaza, near the City Hall, the octagonal City Hall. Have these buildings been, are they all used for what they were originally built for?
That's one of the most interesting things about the Civic Plaza. It's a model of adaptive reuse, because every building in the plaza, except for the Methodist Church, has had a second use, and sometimes very different from the first use. For example, the City Hall was originally a publishing center. The music center across the street was originally a synagogue. The Scientology building was a Masonic temple, and so it goes. And that's one of the model things about the Civic Center, that it shows that these great civic buildings can continue to be adapted to new uses. And that's one of the things we're concerned about now, that it seems that some of those buildings might be endangered.
Now, the ones that would be protected by Proposition H, which is the proposition saying before you can sell or demolish a building, it would have to go before voters. In addition to Sutter-Meyer, that we'll talk about in a little bit, there's 6 Civic Plaza buildings, which would be the City Hall, the old library, the new library, the old Firehouse, the police station, and the Lion Gates.
That's right.
So what's distinctive about those?
Well, the City Hall and the Police and Fire Building were built at the same time. And the Police and Fire Building, which the official name of it is City Hall Annex, was built to house the printing presses for Lewis's magazines.
Oh, really?
And it was built in 1903, and then in 1909 it was remodeled and made much fancier with a second story that was used for some of the editing offices. And those days they had movable type, and that was for typesetting up there also. And that is just swathed in the most beautiful terracotta ornament.
Do they have lion heads in that terracotta?
Yeah, there's something like 50 of them, I think.
And so if you walk, you can still, and it's easy to find out where they are, because all you have to do is to go park your car near where City Hall is, and then you walk around, and the part which is connected to that is the police station and what used to be the firehouse.
Right, and also another feature is the monogram of the Lewis Publishing Company, which is still up there, LPC.
And so those, just like they were not built to be a police station and a firehouse, it's amazing that you could adapt something to be a firehouse and have huge fire engines in it. But they could be adapted to be something else, couldn't they?
Right. Well, it was ironic that originally that building had 13 large arches, but in 1938 it burned, and they only rebuilt 5 of those arches. And at that time, it was adapted to a police and fire use.
1939. Okay.
And it could be adapted again, of course, and actually it could be restored more back to its original appearance.
But not for typesetting.
No.
It's highly unlikely that we would want to have those buildings restored for typesetting. And so basically those are buildings that, if they're taken care of and if they're kept up, can be restored and used for whatever purpose that University City residents would want them to be used for.
Exactly.
Now one of the topics that we have not talked about is the Sutter-Meyer House, and that's not part of Civic Plaza. That's on Chamberlain, and is it a museum now?
Yes, it's the oldest building surviving in University City. It's a house museum, but it's unique among the house museums in the St. Louis region in that it was a small farmhouse, not a large mansion. It only really has 3 rooms downstairs. And so it gives you a very different view of what life was like in the 19th century. It only was occupied by 2 different families, and descendants of both of those families have been involved in the restoration of the building. So we really can get a very good sense of what it was like.
So when you go visit the Sutter-Meyer House, which is a museum, you get a feeling of what the houses were like in University. When was it built again?
1873.
Wow, and it just very soon after the Civil War. So you get a feeling for what houses were like that were built then.
Yeah, and by people of very modest means. And it was typical of farmers around St. Louis that they had small lots, and they raised mainly vegetables, which they sold in the markets of St. Louis. They were called truck farms, and they were very intensive.
And so the Sutter-Meyer House currently has a lease with University City, I believe.
Yes.
And I don't know how long the lease is for, but
40 years.
40 years. And so since that's already there, if Proposition H passes, that lease would be there, and it could be renewed, and basically it's not changed for, as long as it's there, it has a renewal clause.
Yes, that's one thing that people seem to have trouble understanding, but that lease is there, would not be affected by Proposition H, and it even has a renewal clause in it, which would also be honored.
So it would basically almost be in perpetuity.
Yeah.
And of course, it could actually protect Sutter-Meyer, because if something happened and the Sutter-Meyer Society didn't exist is that who hands it?
Yes, it's the Sutter-Meyer Society, and it's a small group. So as you say, in a few years, things may be different for that society, and they may need another option.
Right, and so if there were not any other option, there would be nothing to protect a future University City administration in 2030 or 2040 or 2050 from just selling the Sutter-Meyer House. But if Proposition H were to pass, that would say before they could sell the Sutter-Meyer House, whatever year it is, 2040, 2050, it would have to go before the voters.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, now let's take a break, and we're going to see a couple of more movies. One is with Sherry Moran talking about what it meant to her to be in the old library, which we really haven't talked about very much.
Yeah.
And then also we're going to see one by Dean Smith talking about the whole concept of architecture and the meaning of architecture. And we'll be back in just a couple of minutes.
In 1934, Mayor Miller appointed a citizens committee to explore creating a public library. Planning began, but it wasn't until 1938, when the city got a WPA grant to build it, that things really started moving. The library opened December 1st, 1939, with 5,000 books. By the 1960s, growth in population and media meant University City needed a larger library. The front playground of Delmar Harvard School was selected as the site, and again, UCity applied for and received a federal grant that covered half the cost. The building opened in December 1969 with 82,000 books.
This was the library when I was growing up. It's where I learned to read. I have a lot of memories. From the plaque on the front, it was built in 1939 as a library. I used it as a child. Proposition H basically hopefully will preserve the Civic Plaza buildings to the extent that they can be preserved. If necessity needs to be that something gets sold or torn down, at least the people, the neighborhoods around, and the rest of University City will have a say and will hear all of the arguments for or against changing this aspect of our city. This neighborhood and this part of University City, and to the house that I grew up in, because of a sense of place for me. And that's what it is. It's a sense of place, a sense of anchor.
Proposition H is important not only for me, but for everyone, because it provides for a kind of a direct democracy. City Hall is and its environs with historical buildings and plazas is the beating heart of our University City heritage. Our roots are important to us. The past is in our present and in our future. And once it's gone or seriously modified, we can't bring it back. I lived in University City since age 8 and would sometimes walk by the City Hall and the Civic Plaza area. I enjoyed it very much. It was, to me, a center of our community even then. Through various ages of my life, it had quite important significance. In this context, I include all of our historical sites, which are important to all of University City, and we need to keep them whole. So that neighborhood of the Civic Plaza is really a very essential, integral experience in my whole life. When you build anew in an existing historical district, it's very important to be compatible. Doesn't mean you have to copy historic styles, but at least to be somewhat sensitive to what's there. And I think that's in danger. That sort of, let's just get rid of the old and do something different, or clobber something in. The danger of overdevelopment is definitely there. If we're short-sighted, it's easy to kill the spirit of an existing, not only a building, but a total complex of buildings, a context of the whole. And that we hope to preserve with Proposition H.
We're in our final segment of Green Time talking about preserving historic University City with Esley Hamilton. Now, Esley Hamilton, we didn't really talk too much about the old library, and that's at 630 Trinity, and it's sort of off the beaten path, but it's a building right, if you walk down from City Hall in Trinity, you would run across it. What's unique about that old library, which has been vacant for years?
Well, it's a fine example of, again, classical architecture. A door frame in particular is a wonderful example of the Georgian style. And it was designed by the architecture firm Klipstein and Rathman, which also designed the Bevo Mill.
Oh, really?
And, yeah, and also the Civil Courts building downtown. They were one of the leading firms of that period, and again, sensitive to the original vision of the plaza. And it was built with a grant from the federal government, the Public Works Administration.
Oh, WPA.
Well, it was a sister organization of the Works Progress Administration.
That brings up the whole national issue. We think of these buildings as important for citizens of University City, but do they have any importance for the whole St. Louis area, all of Missouri, or even the United States?
Well, the Smithsonian Institution about 30 years ago did an exhibition of great city halls in the United States, and they included University City, which had to be one of the smallest cities that was included in that exhibit. And there's a book which is considered one of the standard works on City Hall architecture that includes our City Hall. Also, it's listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and it was one of the first listings in the state of Missouri because our state historic preservation staff went to it immediately when they first started writing those nominations, which gives you an idea that it's also of statewide significance.
So these buildings, I think it would be fair to say, are something which goes way beyond University City. And the other point which I got from all the things that you said is that these buildings hang together as a group. And if we were to go tearing down the Annex or tearing down the old library, we really lose something which is part of a complex. Because the complex of buildings really shows what we want to cover. Is that fair?
That's right. And the standards for the Civic Plaza Historic District, which was established more than 30 years ago, call for any changes to be sympathetic to that overall look of that district.
And of course, sale or demolition would be a big change.
Right.
Esley Hamilton, I really want to thank you for participating in this episode of Green Time. I want to thank everybody for tuning us in, and I want to urge you to watch Green Time at the same time next week.